Good afternoon, Bridget. Are you able to view my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen perfectly, Dr. Nambi.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. I think Dr. Rohini put in the managerial perspectives in terms of setting up the infrastructure, all those things. I'm an infectious disease physician. Let me tell the perspectives from the clinician standpoint. I personally believe that COVID is the greatest teacher. And if you look at the biggest learning that we have had with COVID is connecting through online. So if not for COVID, I don't think we'd be sitting at this time talking to each other via online. I think that's the biggest fallout that we've had with COVID. These are my disclosures with respect to the talk. We know little about COVID. And this, I'm telling you, after managing COVID for so many months put together, probably around 10 plus 10, 20 months of managing COVID, there's not been a single day that I have not seen a COVID patient so far in the last 20 months. Whatever we know constantly changes. We still do not have consensus in few areas. And what applies to one part of the world will not apply to another part. Even within India, such a big country, you would have differences with respect to practice. And I would probably make it very simple. This is a pneumonia. As clinicians and physicians, we know how to manage pneumonia. So we have to keep that simple. Common sense is the key with respect to the management of COVID. Life before COVID was like this, and India, you know, that is synonymous with huge populations. Let it be office meetings or college get-togethers, or our public transport services, or let it be our outpatient services in hospitals. India was synonymous with crowds, and with COVID, things changed drastically. And in terms of the impact, we had a huge number of patients, anxious public. The biggest problem with COVID was there is uncertainty in the scientific evidence with contradicting literature. And one day you would have someone saying hydroxychloroquine works, another day you would say that it does not work. And then it's so with every single drug, with lopinavir, ritonavir, remdesivir, tocilizumab, whatever was dished out as a treatment was all found to be not that effective sometime later. So there was contradicting literature, and which was dynamic, and then we had a huge deluge of information. Have we not managed pandemics before? Yes, we've had a big pandemic in 2009 when we had the H1N1 influenza A, and we had this happening in 2020. The biggest difference is the social media. With 2009 pandemic, we didn't have the social media. Let it be the WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebooks. The access to information was not that easy. But the problem with this pandemic is you had information, you had misinformation. As a result, doctors were confused. We were swayed by stories under the pressures of a crisis. And you always had, the treating clinician, always had the fear of contagion. Will I pick up the infection? Am I going to transmit to my family members? All those things ran through the mind of an average clinician while they were tending to care patients with COVID. To start things on a lighter note, and this actually reflects the number of patients with respect to the COVID deaths per million people. And on the top of it, you would have Italy, United States, Spain, Portugal, France. And the bottom is your country, another friend of yours, New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand have the lowest mortality per million people. And probably the scientific reason is to look into the way they were kind of closing their wine bottles. So probably Australia and New Zealand have screw tops. That could be one of the reasons why you've had low mortality. Jokes apart, the key point with respect to COVID is the use of masks. And nothing exemplifies this much better than anything else. And if you see countries like South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, Vietnam, they all handle the pandemic much, much, much better than India or Middle East countries, or it will be the United Kingdom, the Europe, and US. The fundamental difference in between this group of nations of South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, the rest of the world was nothing but public discipline and consistent use of masks. So that was the biggest difference. And Australia and New Zealand being islands, kind of worked out in their favor because you are not sharing your boundaries with another country. So it could lock down virtually effectively. in Australia and New Zealand, plus you had stringent measures in terms of lockdown. Whereas in a country like India, United Kingdom, or Europe, where countries share borders, most of the countries in Europe are landlocked. So what happens in Germany would affect in Spain, what happens in Spain would affect Italy. So that's how Europe was closely packed. So they didn't use masks consistently, and hence they were affected. When you compare COVID with influenza, the key number that you look into is the RO number, estimate of how many people will be infected by an average individual with the disease. With influenza, one infected person is expected to infect 1.3 persons, whereas with COVID-19 it was double, 2 to 2.5. Influenza had a short incubation period of 1 to 4 days, whereas with COVID it was around 1 to 14 days. Hospitalization rate with influenza is 2%, whereas with COVID-19 is much higher, 19%. Case fatality rate again with influenza is around 0.1%, whereas with COVID-19 is around 2 to 3%. Why? Because COVID is a new disease, and then you had a huge chunk of susceptible population who do not have existing immune response countering COVID, and that was not the case with influenza. So where does the coronavirus stand in terms of its infectivity and the mortality? So how effectively it could kill? It is not as effective in killing with respect to when you compare it with bird flu, MERS, Ebola, or even the SARS, or the smallpox, or the Spanish flu. In terms of transmissibility, it is somewhat better than the swine flu, the seasonal flu, and the common cold, but not as bad as chickenpox and measles. What worked in its favor was it was a virus that could not kill as bad as something like MERS, or it was not spreading as fast as chickenpox. It stood in the middle category on its ability to kill as well as on its ability to spread. So that worked in its favor in terms of its pandemic spread. And that was the case with respect to the ancestral strain that was originating from Wuhan, China. But if you look into the Delta variant, which had originated from India, and that was the responsible for the second wave in India, and that's the common variant in right now in UK and Europe as well as the US. It is much more transmissible than the MERS, the SARS, Ebola, common cold, etc. And it was found to be as transmissible as chickenpox. And that explains why this Delta variant fueled the second wave, which was a massive wave in India as well as Europe. And ability to kill, again, the Delta variant was slightly higher or better than the ancestral strain. From a clinician standpoint, COVID is a fascinating disease. It's a kind of a dynamic disease. The disease changes its face, changes its real face over a period of time. Right from day 0 to day 5 in general, most people have fever, cough, sore throat, coryza, or sometimes loss of smell, anosmia, all those things. If you are in that lucky 80%, the symptoms does settle on its own by day 4, day 5. And patients get better. But 20% of people, what happens between day 6 to day 10 is the inflammatory response that comes from the host. If it has to be mature and controlled, it controls the virus, antibodies are formed, patient recovers. But when the inflammatory host response becomes immature and it is uncontrolled, that is when the phase of pneumonia sets in. And with progressive pneumonia, then you have respiratory distress, failure, ARDS. At times the heart can be involved, resulting in myocarditis and cardiac failure. In general, day 0 to day 5, not much of a problem except for the fever. Control of fever is what you would look into it. Day 6 to day 10 is the transition period where 80% get better, 20% run into problems. After day 10, there is progression of pneumonia, and when your inflammatory response is not in a mature way, patients would land in with respiratory failure requiring ICU care. So I would probably put it this way: the virus rarely does the damage. The virus sets the inflammatory cascade. If the inflammatory cascade is in a responsible, mature way, the virus gets terminated. But when the host inflammatory response behaves in an immature way, that is when the problem begins with COVID. So people who die with COVID or people who land up in ICU with complications rarely have their virus in their system. It's the host inflammatory response that does the majority of damage in patients with COVID pneumonia. And this is one of those Indian government's classification, which they had come up in the early part of April, May 2020, where they had tried to categorize patients into mild, moderate, severe. This was based upon symptomatology. Mild with someone from day 0 to day 5, you have fever with upper respiratory symptoms and otherwise fine. Whereas with moderate is the pneumonia begins to develop, you have a high respiratory rate, saturation, oxygen saturation beginning to drop. Severe is someone requiring ICU admission, and you have frank hypoxemia with oxygen saturation less than 90%, hypotension, myocarditis, ARDS, all those things comes into the severe category. And it is not only looking into the clinical presentation, we need to look into the host characteristic also. In general, people of younger age and people do not have comorbidities are expected to do well. Outliers do lie in every single category, but in the majority, young individuals and people who do not have comorbidities do well with COVID. So if you, even if you're going to have a mild symptoms in a host, like someone with a chronic kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, or someone with a liver disease, or underlying lung disease, someone on immunosuppression for various reasons, they would be the categories that would be requiring frequent monitoring. This is our Apollo algorithm with respect to the investigation and treatment protocol for COVID-19. I think this was first published or circulated in April 2020. And after that, we've had 27 revisions so far, where we categorize patients based upon the clinical severity into mild, moderate, and severe. And we had the WHO, the World Health Organization scale of severity of pneumonia, somewhat as a comparison, where we followed the ordinal scale for clinical improvement. So where the scale score could be from 0 to 8, 0 being a very good score and 8 being the worst score that you could have with pneumonia. And we had patients categorized into mild, moderate, and severe. And in the mild, we had another subgroup where a patient could have mild symptoms, but who could have risk factors for progression of disease. Based upon the categories, we had given guidance on the nature of drugs to be used, as well as the investigations to be done. And let me go through the individual recommendations with respect to the drugs that were used in the management of mild COVID, moderate COVID, or severe COVID. These guidelines were published by a group of multidisciplinary consultants, and you had physicians, critical care consultants, pulmonologists, infectious disease consultants, microbiologists, all put together, a team of around 17 people who worked meticulously with, kept pace with changing literature to have guidelines being changed periodically so that the clinicians could be alerted on appropriate therapy. So going on to the individual treatment categories, treatment of the mildly ill outpatient. Mildly ill outpatient, generally you don't require any treatment because they expect to get better. A mildly ill outpatient with a high risk of progression, someone with comorbidities or immunosuppression or age greater than 65 years of age, interventions that could help. Symptomatic treatments always go like paracetamol, cough suppressants, inhaled budesonide. This was not there in the early part of the pandemic, but later we did have good literature support to use high doses of inhaled budesonide, almost 800 micrograms 3 times a day, which could be given via spacer, and it was found to be helpful in the management of outpatients with COVID who are expected to have a higher risk of progression of disease. Colchicine was another drug that was found to be helpful, 0.5 milligram used twice daily for the initial 3 days, and then used once daily for the next 7 days. And of course, the game changer that came this year was the monoclonal antibodies. That was again very good addition in the COVID armamentarium, in the management of patients, in outpatients definitely, with COVID, the monoclonal antibodies. The interventions that wouldn't help, I've just listed on the right side of the screen. I'm not going to even say what is that because that list is long. What would help is inhaled budesonide, monoclonal antibodies, colchicine in a very few subset of patients. In a moderately ill patient, what works is dexamethasone, steroids, prophylactic anticoagulation, low molecular weight heparin in most of the situations, monoclonal antibodies in a higher dose, not the routine dose of 600 milligram. Probably we need to give 4 grams of 4000 milligram monoclonal antibodies, and it would be useful if the patient is seronegative, they are antibody negative. The role of remdesivir is again under lot of question. The World Health Organization clearly said that is not going to be of any use. Another drug like tofacitinib, again, whether it work or not is still under question. But what works for the moderately ill patient is dexamethasone and prophylactic anticoagulation. What would not work is hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, aspirin, convalescent plasma, colchicine, interferons. All these things would not work in the moderately ill patient. Someone with an oxygen saturation between 90 to 95, with a good pneumonia, ongoing fever with high inflammatory markers. So steroids and low molecular weight heparin would be the answer. If they are antibody negative, probably higher dose of monoclonal antibodies, provided they can afford, because cost is a major restraint in the use of monoclonal antibodies. And remdesivir, this was one drug which came with a lot of hype, probably considered a good antiviral. If given early in the course, probably still some clinicians would prefer to use it in people with comorbidities. But the World Health Organization was very categorical in saying that they would suggest against administering remdesivir in addition to any standard care. So possibly no benefit or little difference compared with usual care. And subsequent to this recommendation, the Indian government also kind of dropped remdesivir from the treatment protocol. Otherwise, until this year, May, June, remdesivir was part of our protocol. But after that, once the WHO recommendation came out very clearly, and the Indian government also came up with a recommendation saying that it's not going to be useful, it is now off the list of the treatment protocols in most of the treatment protocols. Going on to the severely ill patient who is in the high dependency unit or in the ICU with oxygen support, could be something from high flow oxygen, non-invasive ventilation on the ventilator. What would definitely work is dexamethasone, and of course prophylactic anticoagulation. Interleukin 6 inhibitors like tocilizumab, and Janus kinase inhibitors like baricitinib. These are drugs that are useful in the management of severely ill patient with COVID. If there is one game changer in the management of COVID, is corticosteroids. If you ask me, if not for steroids, what would have been the mortality of COVID? I really do not know. And there was a period in March, April, and May 2020 where we didn't use steroids in the management of COVID because we didn't have that information. And probably we thought that the experience from SARS and MERS was, as well as influenza, was not to use steroids. But early information from the US in the late part of April and May 2020, there was some information to say that steroids were helpful. And that kind of changed our practice in May 2020. Even before the World Health Organization came up with a recommendation, we started using steroids regularly in our patient, not in the initial 7 days. It's generally after the 8th day when they have pneumonia with oxygen saturation dropping. In that situation, you would use steroids. The dose is dexamethasone 6 milligram once daily for a minimum duration of 7 to 10 days. You could otherwise use an equivalent dose of hydrocortisone of 50 milligram 3 times a day, or it could be oral prednisolone 40 milligram once daily. The game changer in the management of COVID is actually steroids, dexamethasone. And with respect to tocilizumab, the early part of the pandemic, first wave, there was a lot of use of tocilizumab. And then there was a period from September to December 2020, tocilizumab was off the treatment guidelines, most of the treatment guidelines, until we have this data from the recovery group of investigators, which again put tocilizumab into the spotlight, saying that it does improve, does reduce mortality when you compare that with usual care. So if you're going to have some patient not improving on steroids and low molecular weight heparin, worsening oxygenation in spite of getting 48 to 72 hours of steroids, then probably the drug to go would be tocilizumab. The problem is this drug is not manufactured in India. It is imported by an Indian pharma, and then it has to be marketed here. So there are availability issues. And for an average Indian patient, it's costly. The cost is prohibitive for tocilizumab. So that was the role of tocilizumab, but nevertheless a very useful drug. Until then, we kind of bumped on baricitinib, the Janus kinase inhibitor. We never used it in the first wave. Probably in the second wave, we did realize that this drug could be helpful. We have some data from the Covibariate trial, even though we need more clarity because this was a secondary endpoint with respect to mortality in that trial. But you have a US FDA emergency use authorization for this drug in August 2021, and it's much cost effective than tocilizumab. It can be given orally. All you need is 4 milligrams of drug once daily for a period of for 2 weeks, or earlier patient gets discharged, you can stop it earlier also. So it can be considered for severely ill patients who cannot get tocilizumab for whatever be the reasons. Perhaps we need to wait for the baricitinib arm of the recovery trial to get the final answers. It's a useful drug because it is very, very cost effective in Indian scenario. I'm not sure what it would mean in country like Australia, but in India it is actually, it does cost only not more than $5. It is very cheap, $5 US. It is very cheap when compared to tocilizumab. We found it useful in select set of patients who were not improving on steroids and who cannot get tocilizumab for whatever be the reasons. So the snapshot of the current therapies with respect to the effects of mortality, and again the scale that is mentioned 1 to 7 is with respect to the WHO ordinal scale. In general, you don't need any drugs for someone in an ordinal scale of 1, 2, 3, 4. If it is going to be 5, 6, 7, dexamethasone still remains the king. If someone is not improving on dexamethasone, then tocilizumab is an option. And someone starting to have problems at the ordinal scale 3 to 4, then there could be a role for baricitinib. There is some encouraging information on tafasitamab also. There are a few Indian clinicians who have used this drug effectively. In the Apollo system, we have not used it that frequently. But these are drugs to watch out for, both baricitinib and tafasitamab. Drugs that are proven would be dexamethasone and tocilizumab. Word on the anticoagulation. I don't think there was any other infectious agent that could have been so vasculopathic in the history of infectious diseases than COVID. You would have had all sort of complications. Pulmonary embolism, you've had all kinds of pulmonary embolism, saddle embolus, major artery being blocked, or a subsegmental, segmental, anything to do with the pulmonary vasculature, vascular complications, COVID could do it. DVT, strokes, acute myocardial infarctions, during COVID, post-COVID, all those things were quite common with COVID. Never we have had a vasculopathic infectious agent so far in the history of infectious diseases. So in general, low molecular weight heparin is a must for patients who get hospitalized with COVID with either mild to moderate symptoms or moderate to severe symptoms. Outpatients do not require any low molecular weight heparin. Patients who get discharged from the hospital having a moderate to severe COVID, it's a common practice to use oral anticoagulants for a period of at least 2 weeks, depending upon the risk factors. Antibiotics in COVID, in general, antibiotics are not required when you are very sure that you're dealing with only COVID, because secondary bacterial infection complicating COVID, like influenza, is quite uncommon. With flu, the commonest cause for mortality was, in addition to the virus induced damage, it was the secondary bacterial infections with Staphylococcus aureus, pneumococcus, whereas with COVID, you would rarely have a pneumococcus, Haemophilus, or Staph aureus complicating secondary pneumonias. So you would not use antibiotics in an situation where you know that you're dealing with only COVID pneumonia, procalcitonin would help in that situation. CRP is not useful because most patients with COVID would have raised CRP. And so it would not be helpful in distinguishing the viral from a bacterial disease process. And this is one publication from the ICMR. ICMR is the Indian Council of Medical Research, which is the apex organization which laid out the guidelines along with the government of India for the management of COVID. They had looked into secondary infections in hospitalized COVID-19 patients, and it was around 17,000 hospitalized patients. They found an overall incidence of 3.6% of secondary bacterial or fungal infections. What was very interesting is overall mortality was around 10%, whereas when there is a secondary infection, the mortality was 5 times more. It was 56%. And secondary bacterial infections are predominantly gram-negative, with Klebsiella and Acinetobacter being the commonest pathogens. And what was even more interesting is the carbapenem resistance in Acinetobacter and Klebsiella. 90% of the Acinetobacter were carbapenem resistant, and Klebsiella was around 70%. So this is the impact of having a secondary bacterial infection in someone hospitalized with COVID in your ICU. And this is again the pie chart of the organisms, Klebsiella followed by Acinetobacter, predominantly having it to be carbapenem resistant. Unlike a Western ICU or an Australian ICU where you would have Staphylococcus aureus as a common pathogen complicating pneumonias, the Staph aureus overall incidence was only 3.2%. So in India, it's a predominantly gram negatives are an important cause for hospital acquired infections. If you are managing sick patients with COVID, always be aware that you're going to have a lot of healthcare associated infections. And it is well evidenced in any kind of literature that you would have increased incidence of pneumonias, hospital acquired pneumonias or ventilator associated pneumonias, as well as central line associated bloodstream infections. Why? Because you got a vulnerable host and the virus itself does immune dysregulation. And then you give steroids, you give tocilizumab, which again further suppresses the immune system. And then you have diabetes along with it, which increases the chance the patient gets infected. And then you have the lines and devices. And on top of it, if you're going to have a patient on prone ventilation, you cannot give the routine oral care that is required with management of ventilators. So it is one data from one of our hospitals where we did have an increased incidence of central line associated bloodstream infection the month of April, May, June 2021, and that was the peak of the second wave in our country. And we had an increased central line infection, and then again we had an increased ventilator associated pneumonias. So the reasons mentioned were the same as whatever I had said. You had vulnerable host exposed to antibiotics with anti-inflammatories. As the COVID wave peak, we had increased secondary infections with both central lines as well as pneumonias in our hospitalized patients. It is very important when you focus on clinical management of patients, you need to focus and reiterate on horizontal infection control measures. Otherwise, we would lose the COVID battle. We need to focus on hand hygiene, environmental cleaning, focus on education, then devise bundles in terms of bundle care for ventilator associated pneumonia or the central line associated infection or urinary catheters, and of course but not the least antimicrobial stewardship. It's very important to focus on all these horizontal infection control measures. This is the statistics with respect to our hospital at Apollo Greaves Road, which is the main hospital at Chennai. The first case that was admitted was in March 17, 2020. And that was a patient who had traveled to New Zealand for a vacation, and then he had come back. And I had seen this patient in the emergency. He came with an upper respiratory infection, and he got admitted in this hospital. That was the first case. And my bad time or the patient's bad time, he did have progressive pneumonia, going on to the ventilator, who stayed in the hospital for a month. Luckily, he went home fine. That was our first case in March 17, 2020. What was the major difference between the first wave and second wave is you could see the numbers. The first wave that was in 2020, from May to October, November, the build-up on the number of cases were much more gradual. Whereas what happened in 2021 is the rapidity at which we had the numbers going up in the month of April and May 2021. The ascent was very, very, very steep, and that kind of put the healthcare systems into a major resource constraints during this year 2021, especially in the months of April, May, and June. Average death rate comes around 10%, and then mortality in ventilated patients, it comes around 35 to 40%. So the patient is on a ventilator, there is a 40% chance that patient would not go home fine. There's a 60% chance that he would do well. And this is my biggest learning with COVID. Outcomes in COVID is, I believe strongly, COVID licks the majority. Majority do not have a problem. It bites a very few, but when it chooses to bite, it bites very hard. So that's a problem. And I don't think any clinician would be confident enough to say that who is going to be bitten hard with COVID. Only time would decide, and time would answer who is going to be hit hard by COVID. But the good news is majority do well. What works as treatment for sure is oxygen, low molecular weight heparin, and dexamethasone. Everything else as a treatment, I still believe that it is a bit of gamble. So common sense, oxygen, support the lung, low molecular weight heparin and dexamethasone, that is the key with respect to COVID. As we were going through the second wave, as the second wave of COVID was receding, we had another new problem which was coming as an offshoot of COVID. And this is one such published case from a hospital in North India, where you could have the panel A, what you have is a proper COVID pneumonia. The panel B, you do find a localized infiltrate in the right mid zone, and it had a right mid zone cavity. The bronchoalveolar lavage picked up rhizopus, mucormycosis. So we had COVID associated mucormycosis, which came as a big offshoot of COVID, especially during the COVID second wave in 2021. And that was again a big problem with respect to COVID. We not only had device associated infections, but we also had COVID associated mucormycosis. Why does it happen? Probably in a healthy human, the conidia are killed by the macrophages, and the fungal hyphae are tackled by the polymorphonucleosides, the neutrophils. But what happened in patients with COVID is COVID per se did have some immune dysregulation. Plus, if the patient was a poorly controlled diabetes with acidosis, and that was a kind of a deadly combination. COVID-induced immune dysregulation, and you had steroids, exposure to antibiotics, and there was diabetes, and that was a kind of a deadly potboiler cocktail for mucormycosis to hit patients with COVID. This was another published case literature. From the literature, it's another patient with a mild COVID, young female. During the period of COVID, as the COVID was getting better, she develops left total ophthalmoplegia with the drooping of the eyelid. Evaluation of the paranasal sinuses did show sinusitis, and this lady did have an acute infarct of the parieto-occipital lobe. So all the patient had was a mild COVID, but she has a sinusitis, and then she has ophthalmoplegia, and then you have an infarct. And this patient was found to have mucormycosis from the sinuses. So COVID-associated mucormycosis. This is one such publication on COVID-associated mucormycosis from India. This data does not pertain to the second wave. This is with respect to the first wave. This was published in 2021, but this encapsulates the data from the first wave. The overall prevalence of COVID-associated mucormycosis was 0.27% among the hospitalized COVID-19 patients. And COVID was the only underlying disease in 1/3 of these patients. And COVID fatality rate for all COVID-associated mucor at 12 weeks was around 45%. So that's a high number. COVID per se, with a severe COVID pneumonia, you had a 10% fatality rate, whereas when you had COVID-associated mucor, it was 45%. So 1 and 2 would die. Age, rhino-orbitocerebral involvement, and ICU admissions, these were associated with increased mortality rates. the prevalence number that was given from the study is 0.27%. But with the second wave, I believe it would have been much, much higher. Probably as the data emerges from our country, we would have a prevalence of around 3 to 4% with respect to COVID-associated mucormycosis in our second wave. Shortage of drugs was a big problem. I know that any global guideline would recommend using liposomal amphotericin B for managing patients with mucormycosis. But during the months of April, May, June 2021, we didn't have enough stocks of liposomal amphotericin B in the country. Most Indian clinicians had to use conventional amphotericin B, which is not a recognized treatment agent by any Western guidelines. But we had to use it, and we did have a good results even with the conventional amphotericin B, in addition to surgery plus a multidisciplinary team input that you would do with mucor, especially the rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis. COVID has brought radical changes, not only in our lifestyle, but also in the healthcare system. I think it's time for us to get adapted to the new normal. So what is that new normal is, when a patient calls for appointment, you would always screen the patient by phone. Check, does he have fever, cough, cold? Is he going to bring in an infection to the hospital? Is he going to spread it to my secretary? Is he going to spread it to my fellow patient? So we have to keep that in mind. Whenever an appointment is asked, consider using teleconsults, Apollo 24/7, whatever Dr. Rohini mentioned. Recommend home-based care. And a hospital, probably if you have enough checklist criteria, you should look into alternative routes of entry and exit for patients with suspected infections. We need to focus on respiratory hygiene and cough etiquette. And I don't think we can do away with masks. Even with vaccines, I think US CDC came up with a recommendation saying that masks are not required. But now I think they're going back on the original recommendation, because you're going to have some new variant which the vaccine would not cover. Then you'll have to get back to simple use of masks. I think we need to learn from the Southeast Asian countries, which kind of made it very simple. They kept it very simple. They didn't go for any high-funda techniques to get rid of COVID. They just use consistently masks. I mean, they do that, they could do it well. So Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, South Korea, every single nation has done well with use of masks. And we should, of course, look into limiting the number of patient attenders, all those things. This is a new normal. This may not be a problem in an Australian hospital, but this is definitely a problem in India, with the #2 populous country in the world following China. And India is a land of huge diversity, and there are many states with certain cultural identities. So in spite of awareness, in spite of all the information that you could feed the patients, you would always have situations like this, where the clinician or doctor sitting in front of the patient will be always challenged thanks to the awareness levels or the implementation of the awareness into palpable action. So that is always a gap between what we know and then what we practice. And that applies to with COVID also. COVID actually exposes the frailties in your mindset, my mindset, as well as the healthcare system. So if your healthcare system can stand up to COVID, then probably it is good. It has good results. If my mind can handle COVID, then probably I am strong. If we cannot handle it, then it means that we are frail mentally. And that's the information that I would get with COVID. Last couple of points on COVID vaccines. You have natural immunity, which is good. Vaccine-induced immunity, that is good. But the best thing that you could have with COVID is you have your natural infection, probably picked up a virus, and then you got some immunity. Top of it, you're going to give vaccine. Then you could have something called as hybrid immunity, which is much more long-lasting, and that would help your patients. And vaccination for COVID, vaccine hesitancy, tackling it will be the biggest problem. India started its vaccine program, COVID vaccine program, on January 16, 2021. The initial 3 months until March, April, it was kind of tackling vaccine hesitancy. And after that, it kind of picked up. And we know that after China, probably we have vaccinated the most number of people in the world. We have vaccinated around 100 crore people. China, the official estimates is 226 crores. And I'm not sure that, but we think that we have done the world's largest vaccination program. If you look into the Chinese statistics, it is 226 crores. I think we have a long way to go because the number of people who have not taken their second dose, we have a significant chunk. And what we have realized is the vaccine-induced immunity may not long last. So there are many people who have already crossed 8 to 10 months after taking the 2 doses of vaccine. So we do not know. Perhaps that may be time for the booster shot or the third dose, which the CDC has already approved for frontline workers and healthcare workers. Probably Indian government has to look into that aspect also. I think in short, I think we need to learn to live with Corona. Even if you get on top over Corona, then we will have something else coming up. So that are the learnings that we would have with this pandemic. Thank you.